everyone, I am Ani Asoyan from Central Bank of Armenia, and I am a Level 1 student at the Global Forecasting School. Let's start our presentation with my colleague Svetlana Sagrian on advanced macro policy modeling and an introduction to monetary policy making. So the Global Forecasting School has a collection of principal trainers, people like Asya and Douglas Laxton, as well as these external experts, and we're very lucky to have 3 people that were legends at the International Monetary Fund. Hamid came from Princeton in the 1990s, and with Doug developed these models that took the Blanchard Finite Planning Horizon framework and extended it to have better life cycle income profiles. And that analytical framework is actually the thing that we've gone back to, start adding all kinds of interesting features onto it, such as endogenous money creation, and all these issues that are coming down the road that we like to talk about in terms of 3 layers. Number 1, demographics. So a lot of discussion about the fertility rate has fallen below 2 in many countries. Aging population in Japan, where over 10% of the population now is over the age of 80. So these are incredibly important macroeconomic questions that remain completely unresolved, like the whole question of what is the risk-free world real interest rate. Olivia Blanchard thinks it's a really low number. Larry Summers and ourselves think that we're at a different regime, that basically we started off the period before the global financial crisis in full employment. We're now in full employment in between before the global financial crisis, and now there has been an immense increase in government debt. Hey Kaz, who's in the chart below, is the person that has been collaborating with Hamid and Doug developing those macro models, what we call DSG economics, not to be confused with DSG modeling, which is typically based on infinite horizon representative agent models.
Thank you, Annie. So today we're going to be talking in this set of lectures, going through initially models with endogenous money creation. And you might ask, why are you starting off with something so complicated that it's not even in our textbooks at this point? And the answer is because it's so important for understanding absolutely everything. We need to start off there because dealing with a modern financial system and understanding the implications for how to think about the world, virtually everything in the world that's relevant for monitoring what's going on in the world and trying to make sense of what's going on, you have to have an analytical framework that's consistent with endogenous money creation. This new research on DSG economics will strongly emphasize the role of stock flow consistency. And so we're going to go through a little module where we look at the importance of stock flow dynamics, thinking about very basic things like the private saving rate, thinking about the capital stock for the housing sector, for the private sector, for virtually every kind of stock flow kind of relationship. And we'll also talk a lot about government debt, net foreign liabilities, how to think about the analytics of that stuff. Okay, so on the page we have again Hamid Farouqi, who is one of the external advisors of the Global Forecasting School in the Better Policy Project. And we have Bob Ford, who's in the middle, who basically attends virtually all of our weekly seminars and so on, and provides feedback. So Bob was a mentor of Doug, someone who I think is responsible to a large extent for his education after he left graduate school. We also have Iohannes Helikias, a very special character who spent many years at the IMF after graduating from Yale under Joe James Tobin. So Doug liked to joke that Iohannes is the only person on the planet alive that studied under both James Tobin and Franco Modigliani. Okay, so Iohannes plays a role of helping us to develop the program of how you teach an economist macroeconomics and monetary theory from the perspective of looking back at all the great papers that were published by people like Tobin and Modigliani and Milton Friedman and so on.
Here, I want to highlight that Iohannes have another series that's basically the top 25 papers in macroeconomics, and basically the person that was pushing the development of those training materials for our global forecasting students was Iohannes, because that's how Iohannes believes that economics should be taught both at the graduate level and at every level. It's all about reading those papers, applying them and extending them, and so on. Okay, so then we have Vahe and Angela. It's a mistake. Angela is the one in the middle and Vahe is the one on the left. Angela was the very first student in the Global Forecasting School, so she's now a level 2 student. Vahe was the second level 1 student that was certified as level 1, who is now in level 2. So both of them are on track to achieve level 2, hopefully in the not too distant future. And of course we have Heikaz, another level 2 student that is also close to achieving level 2. Now how does this work? Maybe we can talk about the dynamic learning environment. Okay, so this slide is very fundamental about our approach to learning in the Global Forecasting School. It used to be the case that under many formal forms of education, one would have a hierarchy system where the professor, in this case the example is Doug, would be providing lectures to his students, and the students in that environment might be internalizing the information. You would typically find out after they would be subjected to testing or assignments and so on, but there's obviously a delay from the point of view of the teaching and to finding out precisely what it is the students are absorbing and so on. Not so in the dynamic learning environment. The dynamic learning environment is one of continuous feedback and learning, where we think of, in this case, Doug being the organizer of the day's material or the week's material, jumping into the middle and playing the role of coordinator. But the objective is not just to provide lectures, but for each student in the dynamic learning environment to be internalizing the information and to be teaching it to the others as quickly as possible. And of course, this means that you need to have people that are possessed with critical thinking skills, that are creative, that have open communication skills, where they're not afraid of making mistakes and so on. Okay? Now, the dynamic learning environment, you can think about optimizing productivity in the short run. Okay, so the specific dynamic learning environment that we're looking at right here is extremely productive. In other words, their productivity is, could be 10, could be 100, could be 1,000 times higher than any central bank on the planet.
Okay, so how is that possible? And the answer is because each one of these people possesses some very special skills. Obviously, Doug's skills are related to his experience, many years of experience developing monetary policy frameworks, but obviously also being the person that was responsible for developing the analytical framework at the IMF for supporting multilateral and bilateral surveillance in the area of monetary policy frameworks, but in the area of multilateral surveillance, all kinds of things. Okay? So obviously, with his experience and with people that have very specialized skills, the combination of all those various experiences can allow to attain levels of productivity that other central banks can't attain if they're not thinking about optimizing along these various dimensions. So Angela, the very first student in the Global Forecasting School, has incredible skills at being able to synthesize things. I like to think of Angela as Stan Fisher. Okay, so Stan Fisher is a very special person in the sense that we've never seen anybody be like Stan, and his ability to switch from one topic to the next and to be able to synthesize all the critical information and just go from one thing to another thing is truly remarkable. So Angela has this ability to be able to synthesize and then to think quickly on her feet and then to communicate things. Now, back to the dynamic learning environment. Angela obviously has some issues. And what are those issues? Well, it used to be things like economic models and writing. So English is a second language, but in terms of preparing presentations and being able to communicate in a way that's very intelligible, her English is perfectly acceptable. Now, Vahe is a natural-born writer. The word suggests natural-born. They're very rare to basically have somebody that can write up to the ability of Vahe. And I would say of working with all the writers at the IMF, Bob Ford being probably one of the best, Hamid Faraki being also one of the best, and Ioannis being obviously a great writer. I can say that without any uncertainty whatsoever that Vahe is one of the best. He would be in the top 1% of writers, at a place like the IMF.
That's right, Svetlana. So now we have, as you can see on this team, we had Doug with experience, Vahe, a natural-born writer, Angela, a natural-born presenter and synthesizer of information. Well, now we got some other characters here as well. We've got Heikaz, who is somebody that knows the craft of modeling. And of course, just to fill out our Sixers team, we have Armin and Hake, if that's in or. We have 3 Hake now, but so you can take your choice at which person you want to add. So the idea is that a 6-person team like this, where you combine all the various people, and you could, if you thought about that in the short run, is you want to maximize your output, you basically play to their strengths and so on. But of course, if you want to think about developing human capital, you would put a team like that together so that they can effectively learn from each other, and so that people like Heikaz, for example, who you can see is weak in presenting. This was like a year ago. If you listen to Heikaz now, you might say, well, I don't really think Heikaz is really weak in presenting at all. And so part of this dynamic learning environment is that there's a commitment by the people to excellence. And that commitment means that when they write down weaknesses, they work on these weaknesses, and they have obviously the instruments to do so because they're working with people that are strong in those particular areas, and they can learn from them. Okay, so let's just carry on and move on to the actual subject matter so you can look at our YouTube channel and stuff. And so now we're going to go into the substance of the modeling and so on. So before we get there, we always have to, do the, so this is something, it's in our code, it's everywhere. I'd rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model. And what Stan Fisher meant by that is, I don't want any damn econometric models unless I have an economist. They're a complete waste of time. They can infect an institution. Just having this idea that you can have all these crazy models. You spend more time looking at a bunch of nonsense and so on. So that's what he really meant, okay? I'd rather have Bob Solo than an econometric model, full stop. But what Paul Samuelson said was, but I'd rather have Bob Solo with an econometric model than without one. And what that means is that it's the economist that's truly in charge, that models are being used to facilitate structured reasoning, a way to help think about quantifying certain things and so on, as opposed to, unfortunately, the way that models are used. I want to give an example. The guy from cybersecurity came up to Doug and said, "Are you concerned about cybersecurity?" And Doug said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, what if tomorrow all your models were wiped out?" Okay. And Doug's response to that would be, I would celebrate. I would celebrate because I know that I have the best economists in the world. And when you have the best economists in the world, we would welcome that all of our models would be deleted, because anybody that would actually worry about models and think about those models as somehow being super important without understanding it's the economists, they would be worried about losing their models.
Ani, we also realize that as part of human capital development, that these really great modelers that we have and that we train have a bunch of code, and those codes are basically not just a bunch of models, but have methodological approaches to how we build models and how we use models and so on. So I would just like to really firmly say that if you're thinking that you'd somehow lose everything if you lost your models, you're in the wrong course today, because those kinds of people don't really understand how models could be used and why they might be helpful under certain situations. Okay, so we will now start with the very first topic, which is not covered in standard textbooks still to this day. If one goes to the school, there's a private school, for example, in Diligent, and in that school they have a textbook, and one of the chapters of the textbook is what do commercial banks do in the economy? And the answer in that textbook is that they collect deposits and then pull those deposits together to make larger denominations of loans to build and finance large-scale infrastructure or housing or capital and so on. That view of commercial banks is completely wrong. And not only is it completely wrong, but it's dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous if we think that way about how the financial system works and so on. And so we're going to start off with the lecture on designing models for macro-prudential policy analysis. But when we go through the actual models, we'll see that they're important for understanding virtually everything that goes on in the world every day, and I would say every minute of the day. So despite the fact that we're going to be talking about designing models for macroeconomic policy analysis, this stuff is the bread and butter for how we think about the economy and how we organize our analysis and so on. So let's start. This presentation is going to be based on really two working papers that were written in 2014 that are still relevant to this day. One is called MAP-MOD. So this is a model for macro prudential policy analysis. That's what the term MAP-MOD stands for. There's the first paper that has the equations and so on, which is impenetrable because the analytical framework was based on infinite horizon representative agent models. And it turns out the whole research agenda kind of ended with this paper because the analytical framework wasn't possible to extend the model in very interesting directions. But the second paper, the 2014B paper, has all of these wonderful results in that deal with all kinds of different environments that are really interesting. And that's what I'm going to basically talk about. One application that we did with this framework after the 2014 papers was a paper led by Ioannis Morandini, where we looked at the implications of counter-cyclical capital buffers and loan value limits. Okay, so that's kind of the second application, which is actually the first paper where you actually had a model like this, where you actually had some instruments, macroprudential policy instruments that you could think about for potentially trying to regulate modern financial systems. Okay, so let's move on to the next part. So this model is going to be based on what we describe as endogenous money creation. So this isn't the loanable funds model that I was talking about in the story about banks collecting deposits and then lending them out. Okay, and it's going to show, and it's going to be clear after we go through these presentations, that this idea of endogenous money creation is going to be very fundamental for studying macroeconomic policy issues, as well as the implications of excessive credit expansion. So what's going on with China right now is kind of the perfect example where you have the combination of an excessive credit expansion. So in China, over a period of a decade, their debt, this is private sector debt, rose from 100% of GDP to 200%. That was done at a time when property prices had effectively gone to the moon. In other words, the level of property prices per meter had gotten to levels that were well above what they were in major cities, in other countries, from advanced economies and so on. So the level of property prices had just gone haywire. And of course, this was all done in a shadow of a banking sector where there was virtually no regulation. So it shares all the things of the global financial crisis. And of course, we're starting to see the implications of it now. So what I have to say here is broadly applicable to all financial crises, but the one that's actually unfolding in China right now. So MAP-MOD is designed specifically to look at the risks on the asset side of the financial system's balance sheet, specifically excessive credit expansions.
Okay, now these credit expansions could be to the household sector, could be to the business sector, could also be to the government sector, okay, like it was in COVID and so on. So excessive credit expansion, so the banking sector just lends a bunch of money out to either the private sector or the government, and of course asset price bubbles. Okay, so it's the combination of excessive credit expansion and asset price bubbles that's going to be the dangerous cocktail when both those things are characteristic of the environment. You would say the probability of a crisis is increased. Okay, that's going to be important. Now, the focus is going to be on credit risk and not liquidity issues. So why would I say that? If you want to look at the angle of liquidity risk, you should really look at all the stuff produced by the New York Fed. So we're not going to be saying that studying the liquidity issues are not important, because they certainly are. Once you get into a crisis, in some sense, it's all about liquidity issues and bank runs and so on. But underneath all of those financial crises, there's usually some looming issue that's related to the excessive credit expansion and asset price bubble. So we're just going to be focusing on the asset side of the financial system's balance sheet, or in this case, commercial banks, but we don't want to say that liquidity issues are not important. They're obviously very important. It's just a very complicated field, and the world is complicated, and it's difficult to consider all of those things in one model at the same time. Now, I'll elaborate on the model. Part of the reasons why it's complicated is that it's going to have to capture these nonlinear interactions between borrower balance sheets and bank balance sheets in the real economy. So this is going to be a very, very important part of the story, that even though we're going to be using continuous and differentiable functions, so we're not going to be using like kinks and stuff like that basically are designed to explain certain behavior once it happens, but we're going to be trying to model financial cycles as being these cycles where things are really smooth before the crisis, when the seeds of the crisis are sowed by an excessive credit expansion that builds up over a period of years, as well as a humongous asset price bubble, which again also builds up over a period of years. Things can look very smooth, and then all of a sudden, once you're into a crisis, you have these incredibly nasty and vicious interactions between the borrower balance sheets, the bank balance sheets, and the real economy. So that's going to be a fundamental characteristic of this model because of the nonlinearities. And of course, we're going to argue that that replicates the basic features of financial cycles, and therefore it provides a useful framework for then assessing macroprudential policy trade-offs. And what do we mean by macroprudential policy trade-offs? We mean things like reducing the risks of financial crises and designing frameworks that can do that, versus what are the costs of these macroeconomic policies in normal times. So if one were to think about it like we're going to show you in this presentation, that one could reduce the incidence and severity of financial crises with, say, countercyclical capital requirements. Well, that will be good in the sense that we'll have less financial crisis, but if we have a higher level of capital requirements on average, it means that that will obviously work to raise the cost of capital, will reduce the amount of credit that the economy has access to, and that will obviously reduce potential output, reduce the capital stock, reduce the sustainable level of consumption, and so on. So it's a question of, a clear risk-reward kind of trade-off that every country or institution responsible for financial stability has to consider these trade-offs. And how can it do that? Well, it can't really do that unless it has some sort of analytical framework for thinking about how do you study those macroprudential policy trade-offs.
So let's start off with how do we think about financial cycles? So the first thing from the empirical literature is that the seeds of financial crises are sown well before the crisis breaks out again. It's the combination of high growth in credit and high property prices. Those are the best indicators of a risk of a financial crisis. Let me emphasize in the past, because the nature of modern financial systems is always to find something that the regulators haven't nailed down, because the financial crises coming in the future will manifest themselves differently. Because once the financial regulators have figured out one thing, then obviously the financial system will try to innovate and move on to the next thing we have to worry about, all of them. So the next one that's coming is going to be related to interest obligations on that, the unsustainability of fiscal policy, and of course, given that the financial system after the global financial crisis effectively treated government debt as being risk-free, so the financial system has loaded up on government debt on their balance sheets under the assumption that that debt is risk-free. So if we run into a situation where the interest payments on debt end up being really high so that the sustainability of fiscal policy is threatened. We will have a financial crisis going in that direction. But as I said, we haven't totally learned the lessons of excessive credit expansions and asset price bubbles because we have China going through exactly that situation right now. Now, in the analytical framework, we want it to be consistent with the notion that it's difficult to identify credit bubbles in real time.
Yes, Svetlana. So the idea is that that is the reality, that, it's after it happens, after you have a global financial crisis. There's, of course, tons of people claiming that it should have been predictable. And so we also want to have an analytical framework where it's difficult to identify credit bubbles in real time, that it's something that's not easy to measure. Or another way of putting that is that there are lots of periods in time where we've had credit expansions that we would refer to them as being consistent with an improvement in financial development. Increases in credit could be really good things. It could be that our modern financial system in certain environments is just allocating capital very efficiently and so on. And so anyway, the bottom line here is that we need a model where there can be both good and bad credit expansions. Okay, so let's go on to the substance of the arguments. The data that we're going to be using are data from the United Kingdom, where they have these wonderful data on the quantity of new mortgage loans, as well as the spreads between these mortgage loans and the bank rate. So the idea is that we don't like to use the word funding because that sounds too much like loanable funds. So we just want to think of the commercial bank balance sheet as having assets and liabilities, and the bank makes a certain interest off the assets. These would be the mortgages and the mortgage rate, and of course it would also pay an interest on its liabilities. And so we're just going to think of the bank rate as being a variable that would be on the liability side of the bank's balance sheet. Banks make money from the spread between what they make on their assets and what they have to pay on their liabilities. So that's why we look at the spread between the mortgage rate and the bank rate. That spread should also be related to the riskiness of the mortgage. I am looking forward to see you in the next lecture.